Outremont. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to say at the outset that I will be sharing my time with the member for Burnaby New Westminster. I want to thank my colleague, the member for the Bloc Québécois, for his remarks and for his support. We may represent different parties, but we agree on this type of issue. The best point for me to start my remarks would be to read the opposition motion introduced by my colleague, that in the opinion of the House, the government should immediately propose legislation to ban bulk oil tanker traffic in various areas of the West Coast as a way to protect the West Coast's unique and diverse ocean ecosystem and preserve our resources and economies. When the commission that was chaired by Madame Gros-Brundtland called the future for everyone, there was an obligation created on governments to consider what the impact of our actions would be on future generations. This created a problem in the sense that we need to look at what governments are doing, but also the impacts in the social area and in the environmental area in particular. This obligation to look at those aspects, the social, economic, and environmental aspects, were undertaken for and seriously for a number of years. When the Liberals were in office, they signed the Kyoto Protocol. After that, during their 13 years in office, they were responsible, however, for the highest increase in greenhouse gas emissions of all the signatory countries. When the Liberals, therefore, say that they recognize the merit of this proposal, and I can tell you that in 1972, the NDP government in British Columbia, it was Premier Barrett who was the leader, had imposed a moratorium on tanker traffic. The Liberals agreed. They didn't do anything to implement that. It existed and it lasted for a few years, but when the Conservatives arrived in office and wanted to remove it, there was nothing in writing. But when the Exxon Valdez incident happened, then steps were taken to make sure that there would not be tankers. I remember that when Eddie Goldenberg, who was the chief of staff for Jacques Chrétien, gave a press conference in 2008 in Northern Ontario, he said that the Liberals signed the Kyoto Protocol only as a public relations exercise to galvanize public opinion. No one could be more cynical. So the Liberals signed Kyoto as a public relations gesture for themselves, and they didn't follow it up. They didn't implement it. Like the former leader of the Liberals said to his predecessor, "You didn't get the job done." That's what he said, Madam Speaker. It is true that we can't trust the Liberals on the environment because they will always signal they're going left, but they go right. They always position themselves as the guardians of the environment. They have fine rhetoric, but when it comes to actual concrete efforts, they don't do anything. We will have a number of colleagues, including the person who will be following me, the member for Burnaby New Westminster, and yourself, Madam Speaker, and the sponsor of this motion are all from British Columbia. You know the geography and the extremely fragile nature of the ecosystems there. Will understand what I have to say. But today, in my remarks, I want to emphasize one of the aspects of sustainable development, and that is the economy, because I am the critic for finance for my party. It is interesting to note, and I want to talk about the new book by Andrew Nikiforuk on the oil sands, which has now been translated into French. I want to concentrate, therefore, on the economic aspect. This book goes very clearly into the environmental and social aspects, and it does deal in part as well with the economic aspects, but I want to really emphasize that because we often see people trying to contrast the economic and environmental interests, like the conservatives who say, well, we can't do this because to help the environment because it will hurt the economy, and others say the opposite. And I say that that is a false argument. As my colleague, the member for Mulcair Valley, said earlier, then we have to realize that that we had the issue in Michigan, and before we allow people to play around with those ecosystems, we have to look at history. We need to take a step back and see what the impact is on our economy as a whole. Statistics Canada published a report in the summer of 2006 in which it turned out, strangely, that it was Statistics Canada that was on the defensive. It said that Canada is not affected by the Dutch disease, and I'll just summarize this for people who may not be familiar with it. That is that in the 1960s, natural gas was discovered off the coast of the Netherlands, and that was going to be developed. But what they didn't realize was that the arrival of so much foreign currency would have an impact on their currency. It rose dramatically in value, with the result that the economy was very negatively affected. It was more and more difficult to export manufactured goods to the rest of the European continent. Statistics Canada had to come back on what it said 2 years later in 2008. Statistics Canada had to indicate that what it had said in 2006 was wrong. Between 2004 and 2008, that is over 4 years, Canada, in particular in the heart of the industrial sector in Ontario and Quebec, had lost hundreds of thousands of jobs in the manufacturing sector. These were good jobs that supported families. They often included pension benefits. When we talk about sustainable development, we think right away of the environment, but in fact, we have to think about all the impacts on future generations. We need to look at the fact that when we get rid of a good job with benefits and replace it with a less well-paid jobs in the service sector, we are actually abandoning future generations when it comes to good jobs. They will have to look after their own pensions. So this is part of the whole question. We have to think not just of the social and environmental aspects, but also of the economy. There is already economic activity in the waters off the BC coast. So we have this opposition being touted between jobs and the environment. We have the seismic exploration that is being proposed in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but and people say, well, you want to kill jobs, but in fact, we're thinking of the people that are going to have to live with the repercussions of those decisions. We see now that the Conservatives are destabilizing the economy. If we allow for these tankers to travel outside BC, this will have the same effect. The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I also want to thank my colleague, the member for Outremont. I have a question about energy security. Generally, a pays like Canada that exports energy has a plan, an energy security plan, because we know that energy is a huge issue right now. Given the Enbridge proposal and the shale gas exploration that we're talking about in Quebec and so on, we need to think about the important issues for Canadians. And so my question for my colleague is, given that this government has no such plan, what kind of economic problems will we have if we have no energy security plan for the future? And what kind of economic problems will we have? The Honourable Member for Outremont. My colleague for Skeena-Bulkley Valley is quite right. We have to look at the long-term repercussions. We are offloading the problems on to future generations when it comes to the lack of clean development in the all oil sands. We've got Alberta Clipper, Keystone, the Southern Lights, and so on. We've got these pipeline proposals. We think that the American economy is going to do the rest. In fact, with the proportionality rules, we will have to reduce our own intake as well at the same level as we export, and that will be a problem. We will leave enormous debt, and that will not be sustainable. If we were building for clean energies, new energies, with the same economic benefits, then that would be helpful, because it is crazy to develop shale gas if we are going to jeopardize our aquatic resources.
The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Last week we saw the Conservatives use the unelected Senate to kill a climate change bill. They have done everything in their powers to undermine international climate change action, domestic climate change action. They're turning Canada into an international pariah because they're acting as a front for the tar sands. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague how he feels Canada's reputation is at this stage, given this government's continual refusal to make even the most modest advances in dealing with the serious issues of climate change in our country.
Good question.
The Honourable Member for Outremont. The greatest danger hanging over us is in the international sphere on a number of points is that Canada lost its credibility even before the Conservatives arrived in power. And we had credibility that we built since World War II. We built this up over decades and generations, and people said if Canada signs something, it is to be taken seriously because Canada has this credibility and upholds international obligations. But since the Conservatives have been in office, we have seen this is not true. For example, when Canada wanted to be on the Security Council and was rejected roundly, then this came home to roost. This is part of a whole. It is tragic, and it is reversible. And when we are in power, we will reverse that.